a lot of people by now should understand that Greek mythology, as we know it, basically is giving us astrology. It's giving us the planets. It's giving us everything that's dealing with the mind, body, and spirit. Greek mythology, all these characters are characters that represent these things. Mainly, of course, the planets, the astrology, and what have you. We know the moons of Saturn, just about all of them is named after Greek gods. Many of the planets after Greek and Roman gods. So we understand that you had Greek mythology, which later we have Roman mythology, which is all basically piggybacking off Egyptian mythology. So when you get into all that, as we talked about, this is all astrology and really breaking that down and understanding, which we're going to really get into deeply in this video, because it's something huge that people is missing when you think about the concept of this Greek mythology and why these stories exist. So we look at these characters, and we have all been, taught at some point in our life about the Greek mythology and these Greek characters, and you got to wonder, like, why did they pound this stuff home, throughout school about Greek mythology and these Greek characters? People don't understand DC Comics is based off of Greek mythology. If you watch the Wonder Woman movie, it was talking about Greek mythological things, dealing with Hades and dealing with Ares and dealing with, Zeus, and all this stuff is Greek mythology that we're still seeing today. So it's been pounded into us, and a lot of people don't really get the esoteric understanding. So we know when you look at the astrologers, we look at math, science, astrology, biology even, and everything that's dealing with, intelligent learning that we learn from school on up. It always goes back to Greek people. It goes back to Aristotle and Thales and Pythagoras and so on. But we know that these guys went to the Egyptian mystery schools. They studied in Kemet, which they spoke about themselves. So Kemet and the Egyptians are not given credit for teaching this knowledge and putting this knowledge out. Automatically, this stuff goes back to Greek, and it's one of the things you got to pay attention to with the English language, dealing with Greek and Roman, Latin. So when you go and look at the grammatic, they says it was going back to grammatic. People automatically associate that with Germany, which still stems from out of the language stems from out of Greek and Roman mythology, or Greek and Rome languages. So when you start doing the etymology and looking back, you'll understand that it's a Greco-Roman collaboration that really gave us the grammatic language in English, which is why you look at Greek letters, you see English letters like A. Talked about this in That's Game, Bible Christianity Finally Explained. So all of this, bringing us back to Greek, which we know is going to bring us back to Kemet. So understanding this, we understand that what we know today as far as our learning process, we getting from the Greeks, who basically lied and covered up everything. So we got to understand, as I said before, they begin teaching us the way they are, to get us to stop being spiritual and to get us to asking questions and trying to figure things out. As I said, they didn't understand how to feel. So they tried to rationalize everything the Egyptians was doing. And this is why they could never understand anything until much later, because they were trying to rationalize spirituality, which is what we are doing. When we say spiritual, we got to go to a textbook or a history book to understand what's being said and look at the scholarship of things instead of just filling it out and understanding what's true and what's real. And now the Greeks have a hold on all of this because of, them, taking control and being the ones who implemented the learning process for us. So when you're arguing this whole thing, and that's one of the things we're going to really get into, because you being a person, a defender of truth, you have to know the information that's in this video. This is going to be real good scholarship for you guys that's going to allow you to super be able to crush biblical religion. If you're getting into debates, this is a video you want to see if we're going to be debating, because it's going to be crazy how we crush a lot of stuff in this video. So one of the things to understand that you have, as I said, all this stuff is going back to the Greeks and, philosophy. Philosophy is like under Greeks, plain and simple. When we look up philosophers, you're going to see Greeks, 100% of the time. And philosophy, philo, Sophie. So it's two different words. You have philo, which means love or brother, and you have Sophie, Sophia. Sophie, it means basically wisdom or knowledge. So philosophy basically means a lover of wisdom or a lover of knowledge or brother of wisdom or brother of knowledge. And we know Sophie or Sophia is the god in the Gnostic text. If you study Gnosticism, you understand who Sophia is, the god mother. And again, the Gnostics believe what? That it's about wisdom and getting this knowledge. And that's how you move forward, by having a certain amount of gnosis, of knowledge. So understand from the beginning, just the word philosophy, when you get into studying religion, philosophy is a part of that, but it always has to deal with knowledge. And that's what all this stuff is about. The gods and understanding angels and everything always deals with the mind, deals with studying your own brain, yourself. The Egyptians said, know thyself. And it's all wrapped up in this little, philosophy thing, to where you have to decipher different things to understand, what they're talking about. But it's all stemming from, the Egyptians. So in putting this stuff together and in arguing this whole thing, there's one thing you got to understand. Basically, there is the Greeks before the conquest of Kemet, and then the Greeks after the conquest of Kemet. So the Greeks before the conquest of Kemet didn't know much. It's clear as day. We've seen them come into Kemet, the ones who was allowed to come in, because remember, everybody couldn't come into the mystery schools and learn. Thales, Pythagoras, they came out saying, hey, we learned this from the Egyptians. And then their concepts is clearly from the Egyptians, because before the fall of Kemet, the Greeks didn't have a concept of a good afterlife. So they didn't have a concept of judgment and then a so-called heaven. Their concept of the afterlife was, death was the worst thing. You die and you go to this place. And now you're in this place and it's just the worst. And then when you start looking at these stories of Homer and Hesiod, the Theogonies of Hesiod, or Hesiod, how you want to pronounce it, you can see clear as day their concept and what they believe, especially in a lot of Homer's writing. And you can see how death was. And it was like, even if he was good, everybody went to the same place. So now it says here, just going to scroll down here, it's giving a reference. It's saying the early Jewish concept of Sheol, which is hell, and the later Christian concept of heaven and hell were partly based on the Greco-Roman belief of Hades. In the 4th century BC, the Greeks thought the blessed went to paradise-like Elysian field. One of the first people to suggest that after death the soul was freed from the flesh and there was a judgment in which the blessed were selected for the Elysian fields was Plato. The concept of Hades is closely associated with the myth of Orpheus. See Orpheus and Eurydice and Demeter and Persephone under myths, which we're going to get into. Plato a whole lot, because Plato plays a big role in all of this. So understand, once they did come up with this concept of heaven, it was called the Elysian Fields. We've seen the movie called Elysium with Matt Damon, where Elysium was nice and beautiful. Earth was messed up, was hell, if you really pay attention to what they're trying to tell you. And then Elysium was out in space. That was heaven, which you get that. So the Elysian Fields is what they came up as Greek. And this is long after. This is later during the life of Plato. So during the time of the Egyptians, the 4th century, again, there wasn't no concept of no real afterlife until the conquest of Kemet. So it's talking about the 4th century when they really started coming into this information. The more they went in and out the mystery schools and came back to Greece with the knowledge, things changed as far as their understanding of life and death. So you have this concept with the Elysian Fields, which will be heaven. And what they're telling you about Eurydice and Orpheus is the story of Eurydice and Orpheus. A lot of guys know it. A lot of you may know it. It's one of the saddest stories in Greek mythology. Real quick, I'll go through it. You have Orpheus and Eurydice getting ready to get married. As they, walk into the altar, she gets bitten by poisonous snakes. She falls dead, goes to hell, or That's where everybody go, Hades. So he goes to, I'm paraphrasing, long story short, goes to Hades and basically begs Hades and his wife to let her go. And Hades says, okay, well, you can take her, because he played music so well and they love the music. So he said, you can take her. All you have to do is walk out of here and don't look back. Don't look back to check and see if she's behind me. Have faith that she's behind you and keep walking. Don't check back to see if she's behind you. Just keep walking out of there. If you do that, she'll be free. So right before he getting ready to get out of there, his dumb ass turned around and looked. And then, she was trapped there forever. So he roamed the earth, basically playing music. And it's like these witches that was mad that he didn't want them, and they basically killed him. And he ends up going to Hades to be with Eurydice. So the point of that is, like, this is a good guy who had love in his heart and everything like that. How is it that he dies and goes to Hades? The same thing with Eurydice, who was a good woman. How is it that she dies and go to Hades? The concept it's giving you is that everybody, no matter what, good or bad, goes to Hades when you die. So that's to get you to understand that they didn't have a concept of a judgment and a good, like a heaven, until later when you have Plato giving us the Elysian field. But think about what I just read and how I read it. What does that sound like to you? Same concept of the Bible. I understand these are translations. So a lot of stuff we're going to hear sounds like biblical stuff, because remember, the Greeks wrote the Bible. Now it's saying here, Plato on the immortality of the soul. Again, this is Plato. Plato wrote in Meno. It's 81 Socrates. I have heard from wise men and women who told of things divine. They were certain priests and priestesses who have studied as so to be able to give a reasoned account of their ministry. And Pindar also, and many other poets of heavenly gifts. As to their words, they are these. Mark now, if you judge them to be true. They say that the soul of man is immortal, and at one time comes to an end, which is called dying, and at another is born again, but never perishes. And here's the source, it's Plato. It's a lot of writers we have of Plato. But think about how it's worded here. It sounds like biblical stuff. Also understand priests and priestesses. People think that, we didn't get priests until Rome came into power. It's the stuff they was talking about back then. And the concept of the immortal soul, which of course they got from understanding the ancient Egyptians. So you have this, as I said, before the fall of Kemet, you have after Kemet fell, and you have, basically during this time, you have practicing philosophers that we call Greeks, because they are practicing philosophers at this point, trying to understand this information. Now it says here, used to be in the afterlife. In the same way that one had to remember one's duty towards another in one's life, one also had to remember one's duty to those who had departed life. If one forgot to honor and remember the dead, one was considered impious, and which impiety is a big deal. They executed Socrates because of it. While this particular breach of social conduct was not punished as severely as Socrates' breach, it was certainly frowned upon severely. Today shall one consider the tombstones of the ancient Greeks, whether in a museum or just below the Acropolis in Athens, one finds stones with comfortable common scenes depicted. A husband sitting at the table as his wife brings him his evening meal, a man being greeted by his dog upon returning home. These simple scenes were not merely depictions of moments the deceased enjoyed in life. They were meant to remind the living, literally, of who that person was in life, of who that person still was now in death, and to spark the light of continued remembrance in order that the dead shall live in bliss eternally. In ancient Greece, death was defeated not by the gods, but by the human agency of memory, which if you study Plato, for those of you who study Plato, one of the biggest things he always talked about was not being remembered, that death, that was the true death. It's remembrance. This is a big esoteric deal, and understanding it would take too long to get into why this is important with memory. This is one of the reasons why I put these videos out, and we get into this. Some of you may understand, but I can't give this away if you understand, what that means. You have to get this. So memory is everything. And real quick, so remember, there's talking about the tombs, which we still do to this day. Now you understand where that comes from. This is ancient. We look at this stuff today, and a lot of people are not grasping that we're talking about ancient old stuff that goes back to the Greeks. These cemeteries, even the concept of a cemetery is Greek. It's Greek the way we have it today. What did the Egyptians do? We still do that today too, because that's where the Greeks got it from. So when you see them talking about the memories on the tombstones, remember, what did the Egyptians have? The tombs. And you go down there, and what's in the tombs? The person's life. It's down there. It's on the walls. And again, I told you to think about that. It's a tomb that's supposed to be sealed off. Why would they take the time to draw this stuff that's not going to be seen by the person that's deceased or nobody else? Supposedly. So understand memory, recalling, and how there is this attachment that you need to have, which is basically knowledge when you understand. It again goes into selling your soul, to the devil, the whole thing with the whole music industry thing. It's because it's important when you die to be remembered. The Greeks, they couldn't just go in and conquer Kemet. They couldn't go in there and just do that because they had people living there. They had this connection with them. Trade, knowledge, everything they was getting out of Kemet. The people was going in there learning so much, and they couldn't just do what they've done. Now, I've elaborated on what could have possibly happened because, of course, we're going to look at it and we're going to say conquest. So when you get into it at the top, it's like, who told the Greeks to do what they did? There's no way they just, came into Kemet stupid. We had to teach them astrology, math, science, so on and so forth. And they amassed this strategy and this kind of thinking to outwit, outsmart, overthrow the ancient Egyptians on such a massive scale. So they got to think about that, one. Two, I talked about how the Egyptians changed the burial situation, where they are now being buried at the Valley of the Kings, and the old ways they went down to basically say, I'll be back. They stopped doing that. And Temple of Osiris says, don't come back here. So we don't know if it was some sort of changing of power that only the people at the top knew. And the Greeks had orders from whoever at the top to do what they've done, because it's just nothing fits but that when you really think about it. So they were smart enough to hide behind the Persians. And this is their MO, their motive of operation that we've been seeing since then. This is how we know it's the same people. They are like, the Sith. Perfect people to put them with, the Sith. Because you don't know who's at the top of the Sith. Remember, they didn't know if you watch Star Wars. They had no clue. So the Sith, he's hiding behind the Senate, but he's really a Dark Lord of the Sith, which is only two. And he's running everything. Palpatine was running everything when you pay attention. But he was really the Dark Lord that they were supposed to be fighting against. So he's hiding behind the Senate. And then he has the stormtroopers, and then he has these other galactic empires, these other empires that can do his dirty work and his bidding, but nobody knows that it's really the Sith Lord behind the scenes controlling everything. It is what they have done, these, let's just call them white folks at the top. So you have with the Greeks at this time using the Persians. So they're basically going to set up a deal with the Persians, gave the Persians the keys to the back door. And if you can imagine back then, if the Egyptians are hip to the Persians coming in trying to conquer, they have to set up a strategy. And it would be in the best interest of the Greeks to join with the Egyptians to know what you guys are going to do, because they might come and try to invade us. So we want to help you guys and be with you guys. So now the Greeks know what the Egyptians are going to be planning, and they can alert the Persians, which made it real easy for the Persians to come in and conquer. Persians come in and conquer. Remember, all of the reports of the war between the Greeks and the Persians were like that. Said Alexander wasn't even there. They basically handed them the keys to Egypt. And you would think if the Greeks and the ancient Egyptians were cool as they have seemed to be, when you look at history, why would they allow this to happen? Why would they not give back power to the Egyptian people, so on and so forth? So we got to look at all this. So Alexander, basically gets hand over the keys to Kemet. They don't return it over to the people. It's, reports that was talking about how the people of Kemet liked him and how he might have had a change of heart or mind or what have you to the way things was going to go. And that's why he was killed, because he was definitely killed. There is a hieroglyph, a carving, a relief of Alexander in Kemet. Multiple civilizations spoke of him, so the dude did exist, and it's a myth as to where his body ended up at. So nobody really knows. But there's a lot to the history. I dug into this a little bit and talked about how they supposedly found his body in Illinois in America, along with a bunch of Egyptian artifacts and some queen and what have you. We don't know if that was true or not. So a lot to that. But what ensued was the War of the Successors, or the War of the Diadochi. And we had these African lands basically taken over by the Greeks. So eventually Rome would come into power, and then Rome would basically seemingly defeat the Greeks. But we're going to get into this. It's a deep stuff to this. But yeah, and they come into power. But we have to look at what happens next, because again, talk about this, how Rome had their civilization, their customs set up the way that they wanted them, and they completely started to adopt the Greek mythologies and culture and custom Hellenization. They continued it in those territories, and we see Hercules change from Hercules to Hercules, and we see this whole adoption of Greek mythology and Roman mythology. So a lot of people don't know when this change happened, but it happened during this time. But we can find, a lot of these Roman mythological figures before the conquest of the Greeks, which shows they had some type of interaction with each other. And the issue with all this is it should be obviously clear. One, we don't have the original Septuagint. We can't prove the story of LXX is true, because LXX has been since proven to be a Jewish forgery. And I talked about Hecataeus and how all the information on the ancient Jews is pseudo. Nobody has any real information on them, as if they didn't exist. We have these facts. We have the fact that when you go back and look at ancient Greek mythology, we find biblical stories, which I'm going to show you even deeper in this video. So nobody is, caring about this information, because we've been brainwashed and taught the Bible the way we've been taught it. And even if you was to put this information out, nobody really cares, except for people that's into what we are into. And they don't understand how this information is important to really unlock the keys to us and understand history and our history. And to really unlock the key to yourself, you need to understand what happened in our history, and understand why this stuff is important, and what information they was holding on to that was important, that pertains to us. What is it? What is it about us? What's going on? So all this stuff is important. The mythologies, the history is important to know and understand. And the more you dig into it, the more you unlock information, as you probably figured out on your own. So this history, if you was to go back and find information before biblical religion that's basically showing it existed before biblical religion, it would change your mind about the Bible, right? So anybody who does their research, you have found it. You have went out and you have found clear, concrete information that shows the biblical stories in the Bible must have come from the Greeks. Had to, because this stuff is before. Now, if you want to believe the Bible and believe Moses and the Levites, and he wrote this whole Torah out, and it was an oral Torah, and they had all this information, and that the biblical stories happened before Greek mythology, we can't prove none of this, then you will believe that the Greeks copied from, real life, because there was no Bible yet. So this stuff can't be, 1000 BCE, and it was a Bible for them to get this information. They're in two different locations. There's no way they should know what they know unless it's what happened to them. So then you have a decision to make. Do you believe the Greeks or do you believe the Bible? More information and proof supports the Greeks than the Bible. So we talked about the Garden of Hesperides story, and anybody who's looked into this story can clearly see that this is where the Garden of Eden story must have come from. It's very similar to the Garden of Eden story. And again, as I said, most people look at it and say, well, the Garden of Eden story is, first, but we can't prove that it's first if we're going to go into mythology or biblical history and take that as fact, then it's first. But in proven history, in this real world, there is nothing biblical that predates the story. So in the Garden of Hesperides story, for those of you who have looked, we see you have the serpent in the tree, you have the apples of immortality, you have the story with Hercules, which would be Hercules, and Noah is also in this story, by a different name, which we'll get into in a second. But the biggest part is understanding that, this story, the Garden of Hesperides, begins with two people, and we have Zeus and Hera. So it says here, Zeus and Hera, the first couple according to the Greeks, seated together on the east frieze of the Parthenon from about 435 BC. The Judeo-Christian tradition considers Adam as the father of all humanity. The term Father Zeus is a description of the king of the gods that appears over 100 times in the ancient writings of Homer. According to the ancient poet Hesiod, Zeus is the father of God's men, the gods being deified ancestors. Genesis 3:20 describes Eve as the mother of all the living. In a hymn of invocation, the 6th century BC lyric poet Alcaeus refers to Hera as mother of all. As the first wife, the Greeks worshipped Hera as the goddess of marriage. As the first mother, the Greeks worshipped her as the goddess of childbirth. Both the Judeo-Christian traditions and the Greek religious tradition insist that their respective first couples came out of an ancient paradise with a serpent-entwined fruit tree. Two opposite spiritual standpoints, the former looking to the Creator as the source of truth, and the latter looking to the serpent for it, share the same factual basis. Again, this is something you're going to see because people are very careful about what they say that's in the professional field, especially pertaining to history. So they don't want to risk their credentials. They don't want to risk their position, their jobs, or what have you, saying the wrong thing that's going to offend people in power. So everybody know, don't say nothing about the Jews, don't say nothing pertaining to them, but you still got a job to do. So it's clear as day, they know, anybody that's a real researcher understands that clearly this, story is first. This Greek story comes before the Adam and Eve story, and we don't have anything that's concrete that, shows that it came, before the Garden of Hesperides. Now, we know that this stuff is older. We have the pottery. A lot of these stories, we have Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, of course, but we still have a lot of ancient Greek artifacts because the civilization still stands, still exists. So the pottery is in museums. They still find this stuff to this day. These stories were put on pottery, or we find them. You've seen them. So it says here, ancient Greek vase artists painted images of biblical figures, Noah and Nimrod, over 2,000 years ago. And Nimrod, as you will understand, will be Hercules or Hercules, same person. The book of Genesis describes human history. Ancient Greek religious art depicts human history. While their viewpoints are opposite, the recounted events and characters match each other in convincing detail. This brief article focuses on how Greek religious art portrayed Noah and how it portrayed Nimrod and his successful rebellion against Noah's authority. So understanding, wait a minute, how is it that we have the story of Noah, you'll see the different name, Noah, in Greek mythology? How is this possible? So in this story, it's a post-flood story where you basically have Heracles or Hercules trying to gain back, the planet for the mortals, trying to gain it back. And he's trying to get the apples of immortality to do so. So it says here, Heracles goes for the apples. The seated man on the vase to our right of the tree is Nimrod/Heracles. The goal of Nimrod/Heracles in the post-flood world was to push Noah and his God out of the picture, dispatch those who disagree with his own mankind exalting rule, and get back to the ancient garden for another bite of the serpent's apple. Its anti-creator enlightenment and the promise of immortality without God. Sounds familiar, right? On a vase depiction from, this is 450 BC, Nimrod/Hercules makes off with the apple as one of the Hesperides gestures for him to stay with them. And this is Nereus, or the Greek Noah. The Greeks knew exactly who Noah was. They call him Nereus, the wet one, the Hellas Guron, the salt sea old man. Above, we see three different depictions of Nereus from ancient Greek vases. On all three, he looks very old. He is seated as if on a throne, and he holds a scepter, a symbol of rule. The simple artistic communication. Here is the old man who ruled. Genesis 6:9 speaks highly of Noah's character. Noah is a just man, flawless, became he in his generations. With God walks Noah. The ancient Greek poet Hesiod says essentially the same thing about Nereus. But Pontos, the great sea, was father of truthful Nereus, who tells no lies. Eldest of his sons, they call him the old gentleman because he is trustworthy and gentle and never forgetful of what is right. But the thoughts of his mind are mild and righteous. Goes on to say, and remember this depiction of him holding that rod in his hand. Says, Nimrod Hercules usurps the authority of Noah Nereus. Nimrod Hercules begins his serpent and mankind exalting rebellion by nullifying the authority of Noah. The prophet of God who brought humanity through the flood had to be pushed out of the picture and his rule brought to an end. Above, on a red figure bobbing, Nimrod Hercules knocks Noah Nereus, who holds the scepter of rule, out of the way, invalidating his authority and replacing it with his own. Hercules wears the lion's head and carries his club as signs of his great prowess. He forces Noah to drop the fish, a sign of his now disrupted authority in connection with the flood. So remember, the lion's head and the club, we're going to come back to this later to make a point. It says, after the flood, God instructed mankind to be fruitful and increase and fill the earth and subdue it. That's Genesis 9:1. That included subjecting every living animal of the earth, all of the fishes of the sea, and every flyer of the heavens. Greek art portrayed Hercules as the master hunter doing exactly that in a post-flood world. First three labors of Hercules, and we heard about the labors of Hercules. I talked about this before, but these are the first three labors of Hercules. And the reason why Rome took over it and brought out Hercules is to cover the story up, because we see more of Hercules, the Roman side, than the Greek side, because we know of Hercules and not Heracles, but that's more Roman. But we know about the labors of Hercules. The first three labors of Nimrod, Hercules, reconstructed above by Holmes Bryant as they appear on the temple of Zeus at Olympia. Boasts of his conquest of the most powerful animals of the land, water, and air, the lion of Nemea, the fearsome hydra of Lima, and the vicious man-attacking bird of the lake, Symphalis. Athena accompanied him on all three of these labors, although the sculpture had no room for her in their depiction of him killing the water monster. So to me, clear as day, simple. You take the story from Genesis, take the story about Noah, take the story about Hercules, and then we know that the Romans took from the Greeks and gave us Roman gods.